The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society is pleased to present this recording from September 10th, 2020. Steering Committee Member Stephanie Cowell draws on her own experience fictionalizing a famous composer's life to shape this conversation with authors Patricia Morrisroe and Barbara Quick. They discuss the lives, loves, and music of the great composers who are the subjects of their new novels, Ludwig von Beethoven and Antonio Vivaldi. A fascinating discussion for readers and writers alike. Information about our chapter and its leadership is available at our website, link listed in the comments. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm your host for tonight, Stephanie Cowell. I'm a native New Yorker, a former opera singer, and I've published several novels, one of which is about Mozart. I'm also a happy member of the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society, and thank them very much for arranging this presentation. So I'd like to introduce my guests, also novelists about great composers, and the women in their lives who loved them. Barbara Quick is the author of Vivaldi's Virgins. And Patricia Morrisroe is the author of The Woman in the Moonlight, a Beethoven novel. And I'd like to mention that links to purchase the novels presented tonight are in the chat room. And also we're going to have questions from all of you at the end of our presentation. So please type them in to the chat room. Okay, so needless to say, I am fascinated by fine novels about composers. And when I heard both of these, I simply couldn't wait to read them. They are both marvelous poetic novels, not only about the composer, but his period and those surrounding him. Venice, 18th century, and Vienna, late 18th, early 19th century. The cities, the music world, the food, the clothes, the way the characters spring to life on the page. It was all so real, I wanted to start listening to each composer again and said to myself, oh, that's who he was. That's the kind of person he was. Now I understand a little bit how he wrote this music. So may I introduce Barbara and Patricia, starting with some questions. Okay, so either one of you, if you could, oh, I forgot to, terribly sorry, this is Patricia's novel, the Beethoven, wonderful Beethoven novel, The Woman in the Moonlight, beautiful. So I guess maybe we'll start with Barbara. Can you tell me a little about yourself and your writing? How did you begin writing?
Oh gosh, that's like about a question about how I began life. I think I first started writing poetry when I was 9 years old. And what I think is really interesting about all three of us that I noticed after getting to know the two of you is that we all started in the theater. We all started with theatrical ambitions and some practice as well. So during my whole childhood until I was 18, I wanted to be on the stage. And I had a lot of training and read a lot of wonderful plays. I grew up in West Los Angeles where there were great professionals at work and there were wonderful opportunities. I was actually cast as Juliet for the Hollywood Student Shakespeare Society. It was very exciting. But by the time I got to university at UC Santa Cruz, I had the sad realization that I had neither the looks nor the voice for the stage. So I thought, well, what else can I do? And I realized, well, I've always written. I had always kept journals. I'd always written poetry, and it was a big escape. I was looking for escape, basically, from a rather unhappy childhood. And theater gave me that escape. It gave me a pretend family. And writing gave me that escape. Writing poetry, writing fiction, it was a doorway. So that's how it started.
That's wonderful. I can read myself in that. So Patricia, how did it start for you? I know you've done a lot of nonfiction. How did it begin for you?
I mean, not dissimilar to Barbara in many respects. I mean, I grew up in a musical family. I took, as everyone did in my generation, piano lessons. I studied voice, but I really was interested in going into the theater. That's what I wanted to do. And I think I came to the realization at some point that that wasn't going to work for me. And I said, I can go into a profession that will make me more money. And I said, writing, So I became a journalist, which I have done really off and on, or mostly on, until I wrote this book.
So can you both tell me something about the story of both of your novels? I guess since we're on you, Patricia, you might as well start.
Okay, I was not sitting around saying, one of my life's ambitions is to be a historical novelist. That just didn't, I mean, I loved historical novels. I loved novels, but it wasn't on my, bucket list. And an editor, we were having lunch at Michael's, which was one of the New York literary hangouts before things changed. And he threw out the idea to me that Beethoven had been in love with a young piano student. And I had just finished a book. I was doing some magazine articles, and I started researching. And once you go down that rabbit hole, if you're a curious person, you just don't stop. And that's what happened. I just went down to discover who this young piano student was. He didn't know her name. It's Julie Guicciardi, Countess Julie Guicciardi. So that's how it began. And like over a Cobb salad at Michael's.
And Barbara, can you tell me about the story of your novel?
Yeah, absolutely. This novel pursued me over many years. It was kind of funny that my involvement with what would become the story began on the streets of Budapest in 1988, where I was living and doing some research for a biography that I wound up never finishing. But at a street market in Budapest, I bought something. I bought an engraving, which was very odd for me. I had no money. I bought this thing. It was kind of expensive for me, but it showed a composer sitting around his keyboard, and he was surrounded by these angel musicians. And it was called Vivaldi, and I thought, wow, that's really beautiful. I like it. So I brought it home with me. I was living on a sailboat at the time, so I had nowhere to put it. I put it in storage. I parted ways from the man who I was living with, and later on, when I was living in a house, I brought the engraving out again. And this was after I had similarly to Patricia, I was having dinner with somebody who was a musicologist who talked about one of the Italian composers. I didn't remember at the time. I remembered his name started with V, who was a priest and worked as a composer in a foundling home in 18th century Venice. And I thought, wow, that sounds like an amazing setting for a novel. But of course, someone's done it. I mean, it just sounds too juicy and delicious. I went to the library. I found out, no, it wasn't Verdi. It was Vivaldi. And I started getting out all the books I could about the music scene in 18th century Venice. And I found, to my surprise, that no one had written this novel. So that was the entrance to my rabbit hole, and I started digging, and I came home and I looked at the engraving, and I thought, oh, those aren't angels; those were the orphans. Those were the foundlings at the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice, who played Vivaldi's music and who were the beneficiaries of his marvelous teaching and skill. So that's how that started. But it really chased me. It chased me for years. It was 16 years between buying that engraving and beginning my research for the novel.
It's always amazing to me. I mean, it's very heartening to me to hear other novelists speak of how the genesis of their books, and sometimes it comes out of who they are in the sort of almost long periods of their life. And it comes out, what comes out is this particular novel from this particular novelist. And it's a very, very individualistic, intimate kind of process. Well, you've mostly answered my fourth question, which was, how did the idea come to you? You both told me that. And you told me you both have theatrical backgrounds. I don't recall, do you both have, I think you both have musical backgrounds too. Do I, at least to some degree? Am I wrong in that, Patricia?
Yeah, I studied piano for 13 years and I studied voice. My grandfather was a music teacher. So I was the kind of crazy kid who was acting out, you know, Madame Butterfly stabbing herself on a couch when she was 7 years old. Yeah. And before I discovered Julie Andrews later on in Sound of Music. But yeah, I was very, I grew up surrounded by music. So for me, in many ways, getting back to this book or doing this book was coming full circle, and it was a way for me to come home, because I think I had transferred, you know, the idea of being at the piano keyboard to being at a computer keyboard, and the idea of using your voice to discovering your voice as a writer. As a writer, it fulfilled those same needs that I had as a musician.
That's interesting. I was going to say, I also, the only instrument I ever played, the only musical instrument, was the fountain pen. I've always adored music, and it's always been very important to me, and I've listened to it with great delight. But I immersed myself imaginatively in the world of string players to write Vivaldi's Virgins. And then after it was published, actually after the paperback book came out in 2008, I was introduced to a member of the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, a violist, and we started dating, and actually we got married. So after living in this life in my imagination, I was suddenly, life was imitating art, and I was truly immersed in the world of string players. So it was pretty amazing for me that suddenly I was among musicians after I had lived with musicians for such a long time in my imagination.
Sorry, I was just sending a tech note. Oh, it's back now. It's okay. A little tech note to our wonderful tech person. If I was your tech person, heaven help this this group. I wanted to ask you, Patricia, did you ever tackle the last movement of is it called Sonata Number 9, the Moonlight? What is the number? I forget. When you play.
Well, I'm blanking out. I think it's opus 20. It's number 14, C sharp minor. No, I didn't. I had a German piano teacher that my mother had, and I think she was old when my mother had her. So I suspect she was like around 110 by the time she got to me. And she also had narcolepsy, which she fell asleep during a lot of my sessions, my lessons. So it kind of explains why I can't read music, but she felt that Beethoven was far too agitating for someone of my high-strung temperament. So she had me play a lot of Debussy, which my mother had also played. So, you know, the sheet music was kind of crumbling, but no, Chopin for her, you know, that was okay. But Beethoven, and it goes back to the way you know, they felt about Beethoven during the time that I wrote about him, that he was really too agitating for females. And he was, both in his music and in his personality. But yeah, I didn't play, my piano teacher, no Beethoven for me. So I got my revenge decades later.
I've heard that you can actually get pregnant from playing Beethoven if you're
Yes, you can.
Molto agitato.
Sì. Moltissimo.
It's really, and you, of course, you gave Patricia, you gave that fear expressed about the by the heroine's mother, that she would become just too over agitated with Beethoven. Wasn't that the mother that expressed?
Yeah, the mother and the doctor, but at the time for women, in order to get a husband, for aristocratic women, I mean, they needed to play a musical instrument. And what were their choices? Well, it wasn't going to be the cello because you had to squeeze it in between your legs, which was really a little bit too risque, and it wasn't going to be the violin because there were these violent slashing movements. So what was it? It was the piano forte that showed off a woman's posture, elegant lines, and delicate wrists. So, you know, that's how Beethoven wound up meeting Julie and a lot of other women, because they wanted to get husbands. Just not Beethoven, but they wanted to get husbands.
I guess it's the same extension of how it was in the time of Jane Austen, and they also had to be accomplished.
They did.
A musical instrument, I guess, to provide some entertainment for the evenings in which you really, before you had television and things like that. So I wanted to know, did either one of you get to see or touch any music in the composer's hand or anything else which belonged to him, which he might have touched, Vivaldi or Beethoven? And if you did, how did it make you feel?
Well, I had a wonderful opportunity. I spent a lot of time in Venice. I took 4 trips there to do research, and you know, it was sometimes a very hard search. Venice seems very open, but it's actually very closed. It's very private. The real treasures are private. And I had heard that there's something called the Part Book of Anna Maria, which has all the solos that Vivaldi wrote for the young woman who I made into the main character in my novel. And I wanted to get my hands on this to see it. I wanted to hold it, just as you say, to touch something that they had touched. And I was trying to get into the Conservatorio Benedetto Marcello in Venice. And, you know, I had a fair amount of confidence. You know, I came to the gates and to the person who was watching over things. And I said, sono una scrittrice americana. I'm an American writer. And they were just like, so, you know, they weren't going to let me in. And I was so upset. I felt so sad. And I later was in another museum that houses a lot of the instruments that were played by these women and girls. And I was speaking to one of the museum guards there, and I told him my sad story. And he said, oh, just tell them you're a music teacher. So I did one better than that. I put on a pair of wire rim glasses, and I came to the gates again. And I said, I don't even know if I can remember how to say it. Una dottorata musicoli. I forget how to say it, but anyway, I said I was a PhD musicologist, and they let me in. They let me right in. They didn't, thank God, they didn't ask for any ID, but they let me in. And so I was in the place where you can page things that are in the archive, and I paged the part book of Anna Maria, and I was waiting, and I was kind of nervous, and it came to me. They put it in my hands. You have to wear, white gloves in these places. And I started, on the front, it says, it had her name in gold lettering, and open it up. And the first thing you see, this dedication for Signora Anna Maria della Pietà from Antonio Vivaldi. And it's this terribly messy manuscript in his own writing, because of course everything was written by hand, then with ink. And there are even places where you can see where either she made a change in the music, getting his permission, or he made the change. And she would take a little scrap of music paper, ink in the notes. And then because, there was no whiteout in those days, she sewed that new piece into the part. She sewed on the correction. So I cried. I was trying not to get tears on this thing, because it was so moving to me that this actual person who I had been communing with in the ether, here I was holding something that she had held, and that was probably her most precious possession, because it was all these solos written for her by Vivaldi.
Oh, that's an incredible story. And I got chills actually hearing it, and serious Venice envy. Wanted to go in there and search. And so, Patricia, did you have anything, did you touch anything or come in contact with anything which might belong to Beethoven or his
No,
student?
I mean, I certainly saw things that were behind glass walls, like in Prague, there's I think one of the first editions of Eroica in the Lobkowitz Museum. But no, I didn't have any of those tactile experiences. Julie Guicciardi left very faint footsteps. So there was very little. It wasn't as though I discovered letters of her or anything like that. For me, it was really going back to Beethoven's own letters, reading his words, listening to the music. Again, I spent time in Vienna, but there was nothing that I found, because they're not going to let you run around. And I saw one of his Nanette Streicher's pianos, but Beethoven to me is such a larger than life figure that, he sort of demands just listen to the music. So I listened to his music, I read his letters. For me, that's where the richness came from.
That's amazing. I remember a story about him once, if it's true or not, that he played some piece on pianoforte, and they said to him, Herr Beethoven, what does that mean? And he looked at them and sat down and played it again. So
yes, I think it was interesting to me to realize that musicians are storytellers, and that may be so obvious to people who are musicians, but I saw the link between writing and composing, which is writing, and he's just telling his story in a very different way. And while, again, that sounds very obvious, it was one of these epiphanies that I could understand where he was going by listening to the music. And it was just a different way of storytelling, but again, linked me back to my early background with music, which was gratifying.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, the next question I had, you've just answered, which is, did you have a chance to visit the main places where the novel is set? And you've just told me about that. I think that, when I research, I know a small amount of French and Italian and a smidgen of German, but it is so thrilling in one of the three languages to read even a few words, make out a few words, you know, and because I then feel closer, because I may not be touching it, but at least I'm reading the original words that the person wrote, or sometimes to have a photocopy of those words is amazing.
Stephanie?
Yes.
Before you go on to your next question, I wanted to piggyback on something that Patricia said, which I can really identify with. Vivaldi also left very little behind. I mean, there isn't even a portrait that's agreed upon, you know, that is really him. There are a few letters left that are just very formal letters written to prospective patrons, nothing personal. And I was sort of in despair when I, you know, was digging through the libraries and archives, and I realized, how am I going to find the heart and soul of this person? And of course, I had been listening to the music all along, but I also had this sort of epiphany. Of course, his personality is completely expressed in his music. And by listening, I realized this man is very ambitious. He's quite narcissistic. I realized some things about, that he would never do because he was too ambitious. He wouldn't put his career in jeopardy, having silly love affairs, or, he cared most of all about his music. And of course, in those days, before there was any way of recording music and playing it, his only way of getting his work out to the public was through the orchestra and the choir of the Ospedale della Pietà, these women and girls who played his music. And so his interest was in seeing that they performed it just as he had written it, and with passion, yeah, with beauty.
I'm sorry, I totally forgot my third question, which is, I would very much like if both of you would read maybe a paragraph or something of a description in one case of Beethoven as perceived by the young Countess, and in another case of Vivaldi. Would you both be willing to do that? They made it so alive for me.
Sure.
Absolutely.
All right, Patricia first.
Okay. This is when, Julie and Beethoven have a very antagonistic relationship, because everybody who is involved with Beethoven has an antagonistic relationship. But right before this, he comes to her apartment and admits that he finds her enchanting. She's 18, he's 29. She's his piano student. I'd never met anyone like him. He wasn't the easiest of men. He was rude, unpolished, mercurial, with a bad temper and no tact. Yet he combined virility with vulnerability, brilliance with simplicity, haughtiness with compassion. He wasn't one thing, but all things. And the worst thing, I was utterly infatuated with him. I didn't know if I could call it love, having never been in love before, but I was becoming increasingly obsessed. Even when he exasperated me, which he did often, I couldn't stay angry. Enchanting, he called me enchanting. I practically sang as Lucy told me to stand still. I've bewitched him. I didn't think that I could bewitch anyone, let alone Beethoven. I wondered whether he thought Josephine was enchanting. He certainly had feelings for her. I heard it in his voice when he said, "She needs me," but I refused to let Josephine spoil the glorious moment.
Oh, love that. I love that. I felt so much in love with both of your composers in reading this. Really, it was incredible. So can we see how Anna Maria looks at Vivaldi, how she sees him? Barbara, if you would.
Sure. I should say first that the book is told in alternating sections between the 14-year-old Anna Maria,
Yeah.
reflecting on her life, and the older Anna Maria looking back at her adolescent self. So this is in an earlier section where 14-year-old Anna Maria and her friend, a cellist named Giulietta, she's speaking, Anna Maria is speaking about their experience. Giulietta and I saw Vivaldi composing this concerto in the sacristy. We had been spying on the maestro because he is so odd and amusing to watch while he composes. He pulls his cap off and buries his fingers in his red hair and sometimes weeps as if it were as hot as its color and he were a martyr in the flames. He writes and writes, dipping his pen and wiping his eyes, a great stack of quills before him, the broken ones flying over his shoulder as if flying back to the birds they came from. He coughs, especially in the months of fall or spring, clutching at his chest with one hand while writing with the other. Then he stands before the clavicembalo, picking out the notes he has written with the most terrible look on his face, like a prisoner who is about to get a beating. And then something happens, something invisible to us, but very real to him by the look in his eyes. It is as if the invisible jailer has unlocked the chains binding the maestro to his prison walls, as if Christus himself has reached out his hand and touched the maestro's tears. He weeps again, but this time for joy. Then he picks up the violin, closes his eyes, and plays. Of course, it is hateful to him if we do not play the music the way he has heard it, whispered to him by angels. The color drains from his face. He mutters things, terrible things about fanciulle, virgin girls. How can a gaggle of cloistered virgins possibly understand music that springs from the loins of a man? We know it is a sin for him, a priest, to speak this way. And yet I know he speaks without knowing how he wounds us. Virgins, he shouts, looking heavenward and sweeping out of the room, his black robes like a storm cloud racing across the sky, bringing rain.
Oh, I love both of those so much. I really do. For those of you who have just joined us, this is called Words and Music, and we're talking about novelists who have written novels with composers as the main male character. One is Beethoven and one is Vivaldi. This is the Beethoven one, Woman in the Moonlight, and you will find the link to buy it in the chat. And this is Vivaldi's Virgins, and which I totally loved, and I lent a hard copy to someone, so I got a paperback, and I have no recollection to whom I lent it. But anyway, this is what we were discussing today, and I'm going to skip a couple of questions because I'd like to know, like, something practical. Now we're going to go out from the artistic to the practical. How did you find your publisher or agent? I know it can take between 1 day and 20 years. What was it like for you? Whoever wants to talk.
Oh gosh, I mean, I've had multiple agents. So, and we shared an agent, but she retired. Yeah.
But the journey of this, I think you told a little bit about the journey of this book. You were having lunch with somebody, and
yes, I was having lunch with someone, and he happened to be editor of an imprint, and he liked the idea, and he just said, go with it. So this time around, I was very lucky in that I didn't have to write the book. I just got the contract to write the book. Because if I had to sit down and write an entire, well, it wouldn't have dawned on me to do it. So I'm grateful that I had this opportunity because, as you both know, it's such extraordinarily hard work. And I knew there was an end game here, which allowed me to keep going.
Yeah, it's very nice to have some kind of security, somebody waiting for something, and that doesn't happen generally in fiction publication unless you are quite famous or you've made a huge amount of money for your
No, I didn't know that. Yeah.
so but I'm so glad. But I've had my own luck. So how did you find what was your journey like, Barbara?
Circuitous. I had already had another novel published, and that's called Northern Edge. It's quite out of print now, but it won the Discover Great New Writers Prize. I remained decidedly undiscovered for a very long time. And I had a lovely, lovely agent for that. He sadly, tragically died of AIDS. And I wrote a couple of nonfiction books. I was a single mom. I was trying desperately to support myself and my son. I was really bad at it. I worked sometimes as an editor. I did whatever I could. I ran a boarding house for a while. I cooked for a lot of people. I did gardening and garden design and cooking and sewing. I did all sorts of odd things. But when I had the idea for Vivaldi's Virgins, I wrote up a little proposal, and then I sent it around to 6 different agents, 3 on the East Coast and 3 on the West Coast. And much to my shock, 3 of them wanted it, and they sort of fought over it, which was so amazing to me. So I gave it to the agent. I went with the agent who wasn't the most, well-known or famous for being fierce or whatever, but she was the most passionate about it. And I felt like she really understood, what I was trying to do with my story. That was Felicia F., who's out in San Francisco. And she had me expand the proposal to make it twice as large. And then she sent it around. And then there was a tiny little bidding war for it. And it seemed like a huge amount of money to me. I realize now in retrospect that it was probably quite modest, but it was more money than I'd ever seen, more than I could make in a year as an editor. And so I went with HarperCollins, and then I did the research, which took years and years. So I was still very poor. And then the novel came out, and, it's been I've never been a blockbuster author. This novel, I don't know it. I'm amazed that it's still out there. 13 years ago, it was published. It's been translated into 12 languages. And it's just been made into an audiobook, which I'm delighted with. I'm just thrilled. And it's, being taught in schools sometimes, and I'm still fairly poor, but it's, it's cool. It's okay. I never went into this to make money. I don't have that skill somehow, but I'm really happy to be doing what I'm doing.
I think that, I'm not a blockbuster novel either, but I think the wonderful thing about doing novels, excuse me, about marquee names or people that people really like to know about is that they last, and people keep buying them after many years. It just always surprises me that this happens, but I guess because it's really something unique, and there's not many novels where you can get to know these 2 great composers very much. I just like to share very quickly, because I find it very amusing. My first novel was sold at a church supper. This was a novel called Nicholas Cook, and I couldn't, agents gave up on me, and I was still trying to plug it myself. This was in the 1990s, and I had given it to everybody in my church to read who would possibly want to read it. I thrust it at them in the box, and one church supper, 2 women who had read it were sitting opposite a man, and they started to talk about Stephanie's novel, and it turned out he was the office manager for W.W. Norton.
Wow.
And he came to me and he said, I'd like to take your novel to my favorite editor. And he did, and she bought it. And after all the trials I went through, and one of the other editors at W.W. Norton at that time said, I better start going to church. I might pick up a good novel.
That's a wonderful story. So God actually was your agent for that novel.
Yeah, so my theory is when you're trying to get something published, something out there, share with everybody, tell everybody what you're doing, because you never know, the taxi driver may have a sister who's a litter agent or something like that. You just don't know. You really don't know. So,
well, if anyone is out there listening who has that kind of influence, my fourth novel is about to be published by Regal House, but it was unagented, and I am currently unagented, and I'd love to connect with a really wonderful agent that I could stick with for a lifetime.
yes,
What's
I know.
left?
I'm a nester too. I mean, I like to stick one agent, one editor is my ideal, and somehow the world has not quite worked out that way. So I don't even know what time it is because I can't see here on the.
It's 6:42.
Okay, so we have a time for a few more questions, and then I want to find out if you have anything particularly you want to say, and then we're going to open up to everybody. Hope everybody has typed in any questions they have into the chat, and then I will read from there, as I won't be able to hear you, unfortunately. So I sometimes feel it takes a village of friends and family to read drafts and help the book into final form. I'm always amazed when I look at the acknowledgements on the back of a book, and I'd like to thank my early readers. I'd like to thank my secondary readers. I'd like to thank my husband. And it's just amazing to me what a village really it takes to complete a novel. And then of course comes your editor and your copy editor and your agent and stuff. Oh, would you like to say something about that, either of you?
I have never given any of my books to anyone, ever. It's not anything I ever wanted to do. And as someone who'd grown up in journalism and then did a biography and memoirs, I kept them to myself. Here, since it was a first novel, someone, actually an editor of one book, said you really should try to give it out to people. So I did give it out to people, and I would say two people were very helpful to me. One is a close friend who's a wonderful actress, and she took the time while doing a series to jot down some notes for me. And she approached, because the book is told from Julie's point of view, she approached it as if she were playing it and playing the role. And, you know, there were certain points in the novel where, for example, Julie hadn't seen Beethoven for a while, but her mother brought her some of his sheet music. And my friend Glynis said, well, you know, what's the tactile? Julie would have felt the music. She would have held the piece of sheet music. So her input was incredibly helpful to me. And then another woman who is my cousin's wife, but I also call her my cousin. There was one point where Julie's daughter wants to know what happened, why the relationship didn't work out. And Julie says, you know, he didn't love me. And, you know, my cousin's wife, my cousin said, no, it's that he didn't love me enough. And that really crystallized the whole situation, because Beethoven loved her, but in comparison to the music, I mean, he couldn't love her enough to overcome what was his great love, what was his soul love ultimately. So in those two instances, it was very helpful.
I've had that kind of thing too. Barbara, have you had any experiences like that in your long journey to bringing this together, your novel?
Well, as I was writing, I always read aloud while I write. So, and I'm really glad that I don't have to do this in some sort of public place, because anyone who overheard me would think I was barking mad, because, you know, I sort of read fast and it doesn't really sound like language to anyone else. I guess it pretty sounds like fairies or something. But I'm trying to feel the poetry of the words. You know, I need to hear the sound of the words. I write poetry too. So I really care about each word. But at various times, once I had finished the novel, I had a couple of very trusted readers, people whose literary acumen I really trusted. And I had them read that draft and give me their input. And it was always helpful. Mostly I just wanted encouragement. And this was,
Yeah.
before I had found, well, no, it was after I had the agent. I wanted to be really ready. But once it was done, there was really very little that came from the publisher. They changed very few things. It was a tiny little copy edit. But it's really funny because the handwritten manuscript, if I go back in my journals to read, there's a certain deathbed scene in the novel, and the printed novel is almost exactly word for word like the scene I wrote in my journal. And someday I'd like to kind of frame those side by side because it's really uncanny. I don't know. I guess, often sometimes poems seem to just sort of arrive out of the ether. They just come out, and that's the way they are, pretty much word for word. And with fiction writing, especially when you're connecting with the past, somehow, I think sometimes you just feel it from the ether. It just sometimes I think I'm not so much a writer as an antenna. I don't know if you ever feel that way, Stephanie.
I do. I remember. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
No, I remember. At one point. I wrote something which was meant to be a book, and turned out to only be a story because I didn't have the. I chose not to go the way of writing the book. It was about the mystical part of writing historical fiction. And you said, I remember you wrote for me and you said, I knew I was Italian. You were sitting by the canal in Venice, and you made that wonderful reference that we make. So I would like to ask maybe one more. I have a lot of new questions here, but I'm going to ask one more and then find out if you have anything to share, and then open it up to everybody and tell you, my dear friends who are out there, it is very strange not to feel you. It is very strange not to hear you or look at your smiling faces, your lovely faces or something, but we're carrying on. I trust you're there, and we're carrying on as best we can. So this is going to be about PR, or making your book known. And I'll share something of mine. The question is, do you have any particular PR events which were moving or funny for this book or others? And I would like to say that for my novel, Mary Mozart, the most moving thing was actually getting to perform with incredible professional chamber musicians who played so beautifully. It was a flute quintet that when it was time for me to get up and start speaking, I sat there stunned. And the most humiliating thing was my very first book, in which they sent me to Albany to a Barnes and Noble, and nobody came. Nobody came at all. Yeah. And all these people were coming in the door and turning to the left. And I was always very hopeful. And I finally looked at them, and I said to the person who was in charge, I said, well, where are they all going? What's happening there? And they said to me, oh, Spot the dog is making an appearance today.
Oh, God.
And my very first book, I was outdone by Spot the dog. I was so humiliated. My younger son, who was there, had to take me on and feed me a large ice cream sundae. I was like, it was a dark moment, But anyway, do either one of you have a particular moving or a particular funny thing which has happened in your entire journey of publicity?
Well, this isn't moving or funny, but actually 25 years ago, my first book was a biography of Robert Mapplethorpe, the controversial photographer, and that created he created a firestorm, and I got dragged into the fire along with him with this book. So a lot of people were very unhappy with my portrayal of Robert Mapplethorpe, to the extent that one threatened to kill me. So we had to have a guard at my Rizzoli reading, which is really not what you want. And then when these were the days when you got huge tours, I went to LA to do a reading, and there was an earthquake. And then I got to San Francisco, and a lot of his friends, or some people who he knew who didn't like it, threatened to disrupt the book reading. So we had to cancel that. And then Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, had threatened to blow up the airport. So all my events were completely canceled.
Wow.
My flight was canceled. And now I'm stuck in San Francisco worrying, is somebody going to kill me? Are they blowing up the airport? So that was my first promotional tour. And they've been pretty uneventful since then.
I'm afraid to say I will never think my Spot the Dog story is special again. No one has threatened to kill me. No one has been killing me.
Well, that's a good thing. Trust me.
Barbara, what astonishing.
Gosh, that's a hard act to follow. At one reading I did on the East Coast tour for the paperback, which was so sweetly arranged by a cousin of mine who was was specialized in book promotion at that time. I did a reading in Connecticut. It was this very well-heeled crowd. And afterwards, this woman came up to me and she said, with a slight accent, I'm not sure what it was, but she said, "Have you done past life work?" I said, "No." And she said, "Well, you should." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you were Anna Maria." I said, "Oh," "Oh, okay." So she was quite convinced that I was Anna, in a past life, which was, that was interesting. But promoting this book has been particularly fun over the years because quite a few wonderful orchestras asked me to do pre-concert lectures when they had Vivaldi on the program. And that, for someone who is not a PhD musicologist or even an undergraduate musicologist, I'm completely an amateur scholar, but it's been so fabulous to be there when the music was being recreated and to give everybody the story. I think the most exciting one was for the San Francisco Girls Chorus when they were doing a Vivaldi program, and the director asked me to come in and really talk to the girls about daily life at the Pietà for these cloistered girls who were very poor and, longing to know who their parents were and all their fears and hopes. And so I really, really gave it to them. And apparently they were on fire that night. Their director came out and afterwards said, "Oh my God, it was so wonderful." I don't know what you told them, but they really felt the music and they really performed it. So that was very, very exciting.
Wonderful, wonderful story. Before we open this to questions, again, what time is it? I can't see the time on my.
It's 6:56, 6:55.
6:55. So so before we open this to questions, because I could go on with mine, do you two have anything particular you'd like to talk about or say?
It's interesting for me because these are such tough times, and whether I talk to Barbara and the Fires and other friends who live in Portland and Oregon and the fires and the rioting, and it's just such, I think for people even getting up in the morning with COVID and everything else. And Beethoven, despite what a difficult personality he was, and I certainly found that out through his letters, his music is so unbelievably inspirational. And we think of the Ode to Joy, which is the obvious one, but the Moonlight Sonata, where it starts as a funeral march and then moves into what I describe as a fiery resurrection, that nothing is going to keep. He wrote it when he discovered, he was grappling with the reality that he was going deaf. And one could read into the funeral march that he was mourning his lost hearing. And then, but the idea that nothing would keep him down, that his sheer grit and determination, that he would rise above everything. And he did consistently. So I find him a very inspirational composer. I did while I was writing it, and even more so now.
Wow, that is wonderful. Can you speak? Do you want to speak about anything about that, Barbara?
I guess, let's see, Vivaldi. I don't know. I mean, I think when you write about people who lived in the past, one feels this tremendous sense of responsibility towards them. You know, you want to find the emotional truth, and there's no real physical trail to follow. You have to go on your intuition and really listening to what they've created, what they've said in this case with their music, but not to lie in any way, not to cheat. There's a certain, you're in a position of extreme trust. I mean, this is somebody's legacy you're dealing with. I felt that way about Anna Maria too. This is a person who really lived. When I started out to write the novel, I made up a person. I called her Pellegrina, and I made her Vivaldi's favorite student, and about the same age actually as Anna Maria turned out to be. And I was making up all these things about her. And then when I got into the archives of the Pietà, I found Anna Maria, and I realized, oh my God, there was a real person. And there was just tiny bits of information about her in the records, very small, but I saw that she was the most talented, and yet she was promoted later than all her everyone in her cohort. And I figured she must be getting in trouble a lot, and they're not promoting her. So, the story grew, but it was this increasing sense of communing with, trying to find what is left, in the air of this person. And I think that we, I don't know, I'm not a mystic, and I'm not religious, but I think that there's something that remains of all of us, of our thoughts and our molecules. And there's a way to sort of, like a magnet, to attract them, to gather them to you, and then you can work with them. So I guess I just wanted to say something about that sense of responsibility that I've always felt.
I think that's very important. I mean, your recreation of either one of you, of your characters, may be the only time, or the first time, that a reader will ever have really done more than in their life, heard the Four Seasons or heard the Moonlight or something like that, and know nothing really. And so you are giving them, and the young women in the stories, life, and you are giving them a personality that will go on living somehow, as long as those people listen to that music. And I must say, it's now being a time of COVID, it's a terrible time, and a lot of us, even Michelle Obama says she gets mild depression, and you wake up in the morning, you think, oh gosh. But at night, I for several days, I went to bed with both of your novels, and read far into the night, and I was totally transported. There were no fires, there was no COVID, there was no the current present administration that was not there. None of it was. I was only in this thing, and I put on music from both composers on my iPhone and listened to it, and it was just heavenly. And that's what a novelist can do, just transport you, to another time. So, is there anything, Barbara? They're wonderful books. Anything that you would like to more? I have other questions, but is there anything more you'd like to say before we open this to the questions in the chat room?
Well, because I wrote the book 13 years ago, I needed a refresher course before I did this, and I decided to listen to the audiobook, which is narrated by the brilliant, brilliant person, Samantha Campbell, who's just, I was so lucky that the company got her to narrate the book. And it became a whole new story for me. I became so emotionally involved with it. It was embarrassing. I was, kind of crying a little, and I really loved it all over again, almost as if somebody else had written it. But I'd like to say that, to give a plug to the audiobook, because I just think it's fantastic. And it has a little bit of music at the beginning, at the end, that was actually recorded at Blackstone's studios in Ashland, God save Ashland, Oregon, and by my husband and one of his colleagues from the San Francisco Symphony, Paulina Seduk and Wayne Roden. And it's so nice to know that now they are part of this too. So I feel like, I'm gathering more and more people in.
Yeah, it's really kind of wonderful to hear an excellent audiobook of your book, because it does seem like a different book. It doesn't seem quite, you managed to, I can't, it's very hard for me to look at the printed version of my books without saying, oh, that verb, why did I ever use that verb? And I remember reading one of my books and saying, it's a pity I wrote this, because if I didn't write it, this would be one of my favorite books. But I wrote it. So I have, it's just, that's ridiculous. I'm being the editor. And so, Patricia, do you have any last thing that you'd like to?
Well, my book just came out last week. So, I mean.
Baby, congratulations.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, everything is a little new for me on this. I've listened to some of the audio book, which I like quite a bit. But I think for me, the wonderful thing about doing this book is that there are so many characters that you can spin off. And one of them is George Bridgetower, who was the biracial violinist that Beethoven, who inspired Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata. So I was able to write an article for him, for the Times that just appeared on Sunday.
It's wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you very much. But so Beethoven, it's, in going down the rabbit hole, you do wind up finding so many other fascinating characters that you would have never, ever, discovered. So that's the wonderful thing for me. I mean, not that I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing spin-off stories, but it's the minor characters, even the minor characters are amazingly rich.
Well, that's what they always say in playwriting, that you must make every speaking part a wonderful, rich part. Even if someone only speaks, 2 words, it has to be great. And I'm sure you do the same. We all have to do the same for all of our characters when we're writing fiction.
It makes me want to go back to my new novel right now and start revising and make this better. But I think now, if we could, Susan, are you there? So can we now get some questions? I see some. I'm not sure if Susan is if I have to.
Yes, I'm typing the questions into the chat field now.
Okay, all right then. That's really good. I'd like to say in my first novel I had a character. It was about the time of Shakespeare, and there was one character who was a real actor back then. He's very famous. He was one of the called John Hemmings, and he's one of the 2 people who actually compiled the first folio. Otherwise, we would have lost a lot of Shakespeare if he hadn't done that. And lo and behold, at one of my readings, who showed up but a descendant of John Hemmings. And she bought about 13 or 14 copies of my book, and I signed them to everybody. It was marvelous.
Good.
It was really quite the experience. And we're getting the questions. While we're getting that, I actually have questions from my friend B, who sent me, I can find out where it is, but she wanted to know, she's interested in hearing if writing about composers changes the way the music is heard, and conversely, does hearing the music. So would anybody like does that change the way you write, the way you hear the music?
Can you repeat that, Stephanie, please? I'm sorry.
Okay, so if writing about composers changes the way you hear the music, does it change the way you write? I mean, would you write differently after you heard something of Vivaldi or Beethoven? Would it?
For me, no. And I tried to keep somebody asked me, did you listen to Beethoven while you were writing? Well, I mean, that is kind of self-defeating, because do you listen to do you read Hemingway while you're writing? No. No, I don't think it had any it gave me a deeper understanding when I went to write about the music, but there were no Beethoven rhythms that I brought into the book. I kept it pretty separate, because how could you? I mean, it wasn't really like, chapter 19, I think I'll attempt to recreate the Ninth Symphony, in my own, it just wasn't going to work. So.
Oh.
That's funny. I think it may be because Vivaldi and Beethoven are such different composers, but I did listen endlessly to Vivaldi, especially to the sacred music, while I was writing about the girls in the Ospedale, because it just, I don't know, it brought me there. And, and especially when I was in Venice, but all the time I listened and listened and listened to Vivaldi, and it completely colored what I wrote. And for my new novel, it's set in the world of the Ballet Russe, for whatever reason, Brahms' Second Symphony really spoke to me. I mean, I had a different character assigned to each one of the instruments, and I swear I listened to the Second Symphony of Brahms and my new novel are completely, they're inseparable in my mind now. It's very odd. I think maybe I'm a musician manqué. I really wanted to be a musician and I didn't have the talent or training.
Yeah, I think I'd like to say that for my Mozart novel, I was very influenced by the first opera I ever saw, and still my favorite of all operas, the Nozze di Figaro.
Yeah.
I was like 13 years old, and when I started to write this novel, the Mozart novel, I very much was influenced by the sort of Lorenzo da Ponte libretto in this, where somebody shows up right after somebody goes off left, somebody comes in right, three people have a conspiracy in this gorgeous trio, then they all run out and one person comes and complains bitterly that nobody loves him in a great aria, and then he goes out, and everybody knows, nobody knows quite what anybody else is doing, but the audience, of course, can see everything because they're in their seat, and they know that the count wants to seduce Susanna, and Figaro wants to beat him up, and the countess is playing a trick, and they all have this thing of going in and out of doors and hiding, and it's in the overture. It's just amazing, and I can really say that really influenced me in the sense of this crazy joy and sorrow, and everything turns out pretty well in the end. Everybody's forgiven, so it was really something for me. Let me see if the comments are in the chat room yet.
Yes, the first question we have, Stephanie, is Patricia, can you talk us through your day-to-day creative writing research process?
Good.
Oh, well, I've always kept a very strict schedule. So I, work from like 9:30 to 5. I'm very regimented. As everybody knows that they can call me around 1 o'clock when I have my lunch and my latte, but I keep a very strict schedule. And with this book, usually I took off weekends when I was doing other books or when I was doing journalism. But this book, because it became a bit obsessional, which I think is a good thing, I did work through the weekends. So it was very labor intensive. And the research took a good 2 years before I wrote. I mean, I read everything I could possibly get my hands on Beethoven, and I was coming in pretty cold. It's not as though, you know, I'm a musicologist or I had lived in Vienna or I am an expert in, you know, the 19th century or the Napoleonic Wars. There were not only Beethoven books, but there were books on, you know, the history of the time, the costumes, the hairstyles, the periods, absolutely everything. So it was an intensive, regimented time for me.
Okay, so shall I just take this next question? I was trying to get it up here. Susan, are you going to read them or shall I try to find them?
I'll read them for you.
All right,
So,
that's good.
Barbara, this is your next question. When you went to Venice to do your research, when you told the gatekeeper, how did you know where to go in the archive once you got permission to go into? Did you know what the archive was set up as?
Well, I knew that the part book of Anna Maria was there. I had read that somewhere else, that's where it was kept in the Conservatorio Benedetto Marcello. So I just asked for it. I paged it basically as you do in the stacks of a library here. And it amazed me actually that the stuff that was there was not really very well protected and they didn't have any digital copies of it. So it was a little frightening.
That's great, thank you. Patricia, when researching and writing, did you spend any time with, say, a musician or a conductor or a composer to know what they're going through?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I got involved with the American Classical Orchestra, which is a period instrument orchestra in New York, to try to, you know, understand the sound world of that time period. And that really allowed me to access that world in a way. And, you know, I had my muse that I used. So yeah, I spent, for 3 years, I went to all their concerts. I listened, they're quite wonderful. And the music sounds totally different. I mean, it really does. And it just deepened the experience for me. So yeah, the American Classical Orchestra was very, very helpful to me that way.
And here we have a question. Rosie wants to know, did either of you feel overawed by the prospects of fictionalizing real historical figures?
I mean, go ahead, Barbara.
No, well, I was just going to say, yeah, I did feel a tremendous sense of responsibility and I wanted to do it right. But it didn't stop me.
Yeah, I would have thought I should have been awed because it was Beethoven, but no, I wasn't, because I just felt if you listened enough and having already done a biography and knowing that that there was enough material, there's very little material about Julie out there, but there was a lot of material about Beethoven, so that I had that skeleton structure to hang my story on. And I did do a very linear, almost biographical novel. So I wasn't awed, but I think also I told it from Julie's point of view. There was no way I would have ever said, oh, I think I'm going to get into Beethoven's head and write from his perspective. I wouldn't have been able to do that.
And what about you, Barbara? Were you intimidated by writing about Vivaldi?
The thing I was most intimidated about was writing about music, writing about a composer and writing about musicians, especially string players, you know, people who play an unfretted string instrument. I mean, it's such a precision game. It takes so much training and expertise. And, you know, I didn't have any of that. So, you know, I sought out musicians and spoke to them about their work. I read everything I could get my hands on about the period, about being a musician, about being a string player. And I was nervous about how the novel would be received by anyone who knows anything about music. And so it actually has been so thrilling to me that that like every usher at the San Francisco Symphony has read my novel now. All the musicians, I mean, so many of them have read it and really love it and approve of it. And I just felt like, yes, I cared about that so much because I wanted to get the details right.
Yeah.
So I was very intimidated. I was very awed by that, and it was, you know, a relief when I got the seal of approval from the music world, and then having all these orchestras have me be part of their presentation, like the Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra, which is a period orchestra in San Francisco, and they're just wonderful. And they had me do a lot of pre-concert lectures and book signings, and, you know, their music director emeritus, Nick McGeegan, you know, he was great. He was flogging my book like crazy, you know, at the readings. And it was such a lovely thing. I am very honored by that reception.
So Patricia, here's a question. Can you visualize Moonlight, The Woman in the Moonlight, as a cinematic avenue?
Yes. And I think I always saw it very visually. I came to New York to go to graduate school in film and cinema studies. So that was always a main interest for me. So having never done a novel before, I just was able to visualize it in my mind, really as a movie or a streaming series. That was how I saw it. It played out in my mind that way. So yes.
Along those lines, here's a question that just came in. Barbara, if you were to cast your book as a movie, who would you cast?
Oh God, what, as Vivaldi? Okay, if it were to come out as a movie or a streaming series, my first requirement would be that the people who play the musicians are actually musicians, because there's nothing worse than to see people faking it. And yeah, I would want to cast probably unknowns who were fabulous musicians and really good actors. So there's no particular person I would cast. I guess I used to think of certain people, but they're all too old now to be the girls because they've grown up. So all the adolescent, I think I thought of Elle Fanning as Anna Maria at one point, you know, and she does play the violin apparently, but yeah.
We have a question from several people from the subject of why would you leave an agent that you like?
Why would we leave, Stephanie, why would we leave an agent that we like?
Hey, come on, it's like marriage, right? You know, why, I mean, you fall in love and then it can be really tough on both sides, and there are all sorts of reasons, and it's a really difficult partnership. So, you know, I don't know. I didn't leave an agent. I mean, one died, and I don't know what happens. You long for it, like you long for true love. You want the agent of your dreams.
You do, and agents can be famously difficult. I mean, the idea that
so can writers.
So can writers too, but I mean, a lot of agents, you know, not returning phone calls. I had an agent for 20 years. I did leave her. I had another agent who the agency fell apart, and then the third agent was pretty much heading to retirement. I think people don't necessarily leave. I mean, if I had loved an agent, I certainly would have stayed with the person. But, you know, when they retire, as much as you love them, they're gone. You know, right. You can't say, please, you know, she got married. She has a wonderful house somewhere, and she's not going to come back for me.
They might not. Actually, for marrying Mozart, any of my friends who are listening know this story because they all helped me through it, gave me tissues, dried my tears. I had an agent I liked extremely, and he was crazy about this big dramatic 4th century Alexandria, Egypt book I was doing. And I had a lot of sadness in my life at that point, and I simply could not deal with the heaviness of that. And I got the idea from Mary Mozart, wrote it very quickly, handed it in to him, and he said, "What is this?" You know, it was like taking me to all sorts of lunches. He's a wonderful, wonderful man, you know, for this other novel. And I handed in. In this case, sometimes an agent can comprehend something you do and cannot comprehend the next thing. So
Yeah.
here we were, big, you know, the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Library of Alexandria was really, I haven't finished yet, but he loved it. And he just said, what is this? What is this marrying Mozart thing? You know, it's just, I could never sell this. And so I left our meeting, cried and cried, went to the Barnes and Noble nearest the coffee shop where we met and bought about 5 books on how to write, because I decided I didn't know how to write. And my friends took this in hand, and within a few weeks, one of them had written to me, "I have taken the liberty of writing my agent," this was Emma Sweeney, "on your behalf, and because this is ridiculous." And she got back to me and sold it right away. So, you know, sometimes an agent can, agents are human beings. I mean, there's probably some really best-selling books that are out there. If I were the agent, I'd say, yeah, you know, and because their agents have their own taste. So sometimes, unfortunately, if you're going to turn in something, I'm glad Shakespeare didn't have this problem, because he wrote very different things, but one will love one thing and one will not be able to see the other thing, and vice versa. So who knows, you know.
It requires such a match of sensibilities, and you know, and if that's not there, it can just be agonizing, because these are our babies, you know, and if somebody doesn't see them with the eyes of love, it's just agonizing.
Agony is the word, you know, really.
Horrible.
But it had a happy ending, so at least that one did.
Well, it's still good. The story is still going on.
They want to know, what are your next projects, and are you going to write more novels about composers?
I'm just getting through the week at the moment. You know, I mean, I want to make sure this book goes well. And I'm not a big multitasker. So, you know, I focused on this for so long. I just want to see this through, and then I'll figure out what's next for me. But yeah, given that this book just came out, it's hard for me to see beyond this, and obviously in the era of COVID, you're not doing your normal promotions, you're not going to bookstores, you're not doing you know, what you would normally do. So this has been, you know, an added stress. Certainly people are going through far worse than I am, but it's a different thing that requires much more of my time than any other launches have required.
I already have a new novel. I mean, you know, it was 13 years ago that this novel that Vivaldi's Virgins was published. And I had another novel in between called A Golden Web that was published, a young adult novel. And I have a new novel, my 4th novel, coming out from Regal House, which is a small house. I'm very excited about them and about the publisher, Jamie Royal. She's an absolute dynamo. And the novel is called What Disappears, and it takes place in the world of the Ballet Russe in Belle Epoque Paris. So it's really this kind of a much larger canvas, and it involves the great ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev and Vaslav Nijinsky, the brilliant, insane dancer, and then a cast of characters who I first started thinking about when I was writing my pre-first novel, about over 40 years ago. So I actually, on the Regal House website, you can see the whole story of how this novel, how What Disappears, came about, because it's a crazy story, another story that followed me, and I'm terribly excited about it. And the thing I have to do as soon as I get done with this podcast is start going through Janie's edits on my manuscript. So that's what I'm going to be working on, and it's being published in September 2021, along with my first book of poetry, which I'm very excited about, which is coming out from Blue Light Press. It just won the Blue Light Press Poetry Award, and it's called The Bus to Apollonia. So it's poems I wrote on a Greek island.
That pretty much does the questions that people have put into the chat field. I guess one last question we had that's just come up is saying, how long did it take for you to write these books?
For me, from the time the editor first mentioned the idea, which I think was in October, it'll be coming up 5 years in October. So it was a long time, but I take a long time to write books. And there was a bit of a learning curve for this because I'd never done it before. But it seems like I come out with a book every 5 years. So I think it really doesn't matter that this is new for me. It's just, that's the way I write.
Well, my first novel took me 10 years to write, but I was working full-time as an editor while I was writing it. My second novel, Vivaldi's Virgins, took me 6 years to research and write. And the third novel, the young adult novel, just took me about a year. I was heartbroken and I wrote it very quickly. And this new novel took me 40 years. So what can I say? It takes a long time. It's an ongoing, lifelong process becoming the best writer you can be.
Yeah, it's really, I'm working on something that I've worked on, well, not quite for 40, but about 35 years, and I've never quite gotten it to the place where it should be. So I'm working on it now, and I have something in submission, which means, it's been 3 weeks and it seems like it's been 3 years. And my most frequent words are, I'm waiting for my agent to call me. I wanted to say thank you all for coming, authors and audience, tech production and creative staff, for our talk on music and words, presenting the novels of Vivaldi's Virgins and Woman in the Moonlight.
And that concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society and our leadership at our website, or contact us at hns-nyc@mail.com. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites below. Thanks for joining us.